Well, Boeing made the news again, unfortunately this time in not such a good way. But the question I have for you is simple. Are you 100% sure that you're not going to have an emergency door blow off during your retirement? Stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with Sarah Samuels. And today, we're going to talk about lessons that you can learn from the aviation industry to make sure that you have a smooth retirement. And as I said a moment ago, that you don't have an emergency door blow off at 16,000 feet, or even worse, at 36,000 feet.
Dave, it's great to be here with you, of course, and
It's
with
great
all
to
of
see you.
our listeners. Great to see you. And that Boeing, what happened on that airplane was incredibly scary. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners have seen the video. But if not, maybe you kind of explained to everyone, Dave, what happened exactly, especially with your background as a pilot.
Well, if you want, you can come up. We'll leave here. We'll go to the airport. We'll come up. I'll take you up to 30-some thousand feet, and we'll do a demonstration. How's that?
No, I don't think so,
Then
Dave.
you can see
I think maybe
firsthand
just
what that's all about.
I don't think I need that experience.
No, you're okay without it? Okay,
yeah, I think maybe just explaining it. It'll be like I understand it. Yeah.
Here's the reality. You know, Boeing got lucky, and all the people on the aircraft got lucky, because if that happened at 36,000 feet, it'd be a whole different story from 16,000 feet. And there's several reasons. First of all, at 36,000 feet, they'd be in a level flight, right? So what does everyone do with their seatbelts when they get to level flight and the sign goes off?
You take them off.
Take them off, right? And also, there'd be people walking around the cabin.
Right, going to the bathroom.
At 16,000 feet, people are sitting there with their seatbelts on. That's the first good thing. The second thing is the pressure differential between the inside of the airplane and the outside of the airplane is much higher at a higher altitude, which means that if there was somebody sitting anywhere near the door without a seatbelt, they would have gotten sucked out of the aircraft if it were at 36,000 feet. That's the second thing.
We've seen that in movies in the past, you know.
We've seen it. That's right. And we saw Southwest had it happen a few years ago when the window gave out and the lady got stuck in the window, right?
Yeah,
but there's a third thing, in that the temperature gets colder at higher altitudes. And this time of year, you could be at minus 50, 55 degrees easily by the time you get to 36,000 feet. Now imagine being up there, taking several minutes to get back down, and you've got minus 50-degree air racing through the cabin. Right, I mean that's.
I'm sure there's a mathematical equation, but I don't know at how quickly hypothermia would set in. I figure pretty quickly for all those people. Yeah,
pretty quickly, and so they got lucky, and the lesson today is that I don't want to leave your retirement up to luck. You know, some people get into retirement, and when things go wrong, it depends upon timing. You've heard me talk before about how, if you get a stock market drop late in retirement, it's not so bad. If you get a big stock market drop early in retirement, that's a problem. And that's a question of luck, because none of us actually knows when or if that's going to happen. And again, I don't want to leave yours to luck. So this whole show today is going to be about how to take lessons from the aviation industry and from myself as a pilot so that you don't leave any of this up to luck or chance.
Yep. And we know, of course, that flying is still the safest way to travel. But like you mentioned, Dave, you never want to leave it up to luck. So there are a lot of different steps that you want to take in your retirement to make sure you don't have an emergency in your retirement. So let's get to our first Ask Dave question. Daniel in Missouri. Daniel must not have any social media or go online often, because he says, so what's going on exactly with Boeing? Can you explain?
Well, I don't know if Daniel doesn't have the social media or isn't paying attention to the news. He might be talking about the Boeing stock.
That's true too.
Right?
Yes,
and we'll continue to talk about the incident throughout the rest of the show today, and how to make really parallels to retirement planning and living with your money through retirement, frankly. But in terms of the stock, Daniel, Boeing stock took a major drop in value, of course, when they had that MCAS situation with the MAX 8, the 737 MAX 8, and they're out of commission for a while, and they finally came back, and now you've got this MAX 9 issue. So from a company, Daniel, what's going on with Boeing? Well, I don't know. If you think that all bad things come in threes, if you're superstitious, well, Boeing MAX 9 has had three things right now. They had an engine cowling thing, they had a rudder thing, which didn't make as much news because it wasn't a situation like this, and now they had this. The good news is that there is no, no one was injured, no one was killed, so it's not like there's going to be a big liability on Boeing for this. So that's good if you're a stockholder. And also the fact that this fix is something that should be a lot quicker than the MCAS was when this happened several years ago with the MAX 8. So they should be able to get these planes back up in the air that have been grounded for inspection, and we should be able to move on. As far as the stock's concerned, the issue with the stock is that, stock was up years ago, close to 400, of course, came down, hasn't gotten back there. Right now, it's actually, believe it or not, at the higher part of its range over the last 3 or 4 years, even after it came back almost 10% with this news at the beginning of the week. So, Daniel, I believe Boeing is here to stay as a company. What we have in the aviation industry is essentially a duopoly. You've got Airbus and you have Boeing, and the United States government wants to keep Boeing in force and active as a company because they employ a lot of workers here. So I don't think you have to worry about Boeing going anywhere. And who knows, maybe this recent pullback might just be a good buying opportunity if you're so inclined.
Daniel, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners have a financial question or maybe about something you've seen in the news when it comes to airplanes maybe, and you want to ask Dave, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. And thank you for listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today we're talking a little bit about what happened with Boeing. If you missed it, they had the side door, I think it's called a plug, actually blow off when they were around 16,000 feet. And Dave went over all of the different ways that, fortunately, those people got lucky and no one was injured. But a lot of different things that if they went the wrong way, it could have been a different story. And of course, a lot of people, maybe, Dave, they're not taking retirement as seriously as when they get on a plane, when they travel. But no matter what, traveling by airplane is safe, and there's a lot of reasons why, right? Pilots have several checklists. There's a lot of different safety things that go on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and you said right before Daniel's question that, hey, it's still the safest way to travel. And that's true, but it's true under one situation. It's true if you're flying in what's called Part 121 operations, which means that the airline operations, the Deltas, the Southwest, the JetBlues, and all those. But if it's some yo-ho like me flying you around, now all of a sudden the chances of an accident occurring, statistically speaking, are higher than a car accident, right? I always hear it's safer to get in a commercial plane than in a car. Not so true if it's a yo-ho like me. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, even though I am an airline transport rated pilot, got all my flight instructor certificates, commercial rating, and all that. Still, those are the statistics overall. But now imagine if I were to stick you in an airplane with virtually no instruction and say, here, I want you to take off, I want you to fly around the field, I want you to land the airplane safely. Now, how much does the risk go up in that scenario?
There's a significant risk involved because I have no certifications and I have really no idea how to fly a plane. In fact, my only experience with small planes is actually when I got to fly in your plane and watching you do everything. So that's all I know. So
which, after what I just said, you may never do again. We don't.
Right. It's getting statistically risky, but not much.
But the reality is that even if you studied lots of books on it, still, you can't learn how to fly an airplane through a book, right? You need to experience it. You need to do a lot of landings. I know for me, it was probably 50 to 100 landings when I was first learning before I actually felt like I could land the airplane consistently and safely, right? So the problem with our listener, Sarah, in retirement is that you don't have experience. Even if you study every textbook on retirement, you got one shot at it. So not only is it riskier than by flying with somebody like me, versus Delta or American or something like that. But if you're doing it yourself, it's like putting Sarah up in the airplane for the first time. And if you have the right financial advisor, then you might reduce your risk down to, the risk that might happen when you fly with me, of course. As more of a private pilot. So, and coming up, we're going to talk more about various stages where pilots have checklists and how you can use checklists for yourselves at various stages of retirement to protect you from a blowout. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and today we're talking about different ways that you can avoid an emergency during your retirement. You may have seen what happened with the Boeing airplane, where unfortunately they had an emergency door blow off when they were at around 16,000 feet. Luckily, no one was injured, but David, it raises a lot of questions. Some people think, hey, maybe it's not so safe to fly. It still is a very safe way to fly, and most of that reason is the checklist, really, that pilots have to use in order to fly safely. Isn't that correct?
It is. And I would say there are 5 primary normal operation checklists, and there's different versions of this, but to make it simpler than it actually is. And I say normal operation because there's plenty of emergency checklists, right? Like when the door does blow off, what do you do? Which I'm sure is the first thing these pilots did with Alaskan Air as soon as that door did blow off. So the first checklist is your pre-flight, right? The best decision a pilot can make is to never get up in the air if there's too many risks, right? And the same thing is true with retirees. If you know that, hey, I'm not ready yet, well, then you don't even think about getting up in the air, right? That's the smartest decision is to decide not to retire yet. But then the second checklist is what's called your hold short, your pre-takeoff checklist. This is where you're ready to take off, but you got one more look at all the instruments to make sure everything looks good right now, that nothing changed while you're taxiing the airplane, and you can still take off. And that's a check that you want to do, 6 to 12 months before retirement. Okay, so you got the first checklist that's, maybe 5-10 years out as you're getting ready, trying to schedule a date. Then you got the 6 to 12 month checklist. Okay, can I really start to put my notice in and plan? Right? But then you have your third checklist, which is your climb checklist. Your climb checklist is those first couple years of retirement where you're making sure that everything is going right while you're stressing your investments. You're taking income, you're spending it, that things are on track. Yep. And that's the checklist I'm sure that these pilots were using right when the door blew out, right? And we don't even know yet, Sarah, if there were issues with that, whether the pressure differential was too high and that's what caused it to blow off. So it may not be a door problem. It could be a pressurization problem, right? But that's why you have to watch that stuff in this critical time of flight called climb, which is your first year or two in retirement. Then the next checklist, the fourth, is your cruise flight checklist. That's the one where you're up at 36,000 feet, you're cruising along, and you go through your checklist. You should do that several times when you're in cruise flight at level altitude. You should do that in retirement too, because that's the time you get complacent. You're not at a statistically high risk point, right? You've now gotten past the climb, and you're just sitting there in cruise flight, and something could go wrong that surprises you. And the same thing could happen in retirement. So you need to be checking that periodically every so many years. And last, your descent checklist. When you're descending, coming in for the landing. And Sarah, I'm going to use an acronym that we use. It's called the PAVE acronym that the FAA has, and it stands for Pilot, Aircraft, Environment, and External Influences. So if you're thinking about retirement or are retired, you're the pilot. You're in charge of your finances. The aircraft is your investments, right? The environment is what's going on in the financial world, the economy, and the external influences is why you're retiring. So again, these are things we're going to talk about later today, those 4 things in each phase of flight, Sarah.
Let's get to our Ask Dave question, because we have a pretty good question here from Jill in Alabama. Jill writes in, how do I know when it's safe for me to retire?
Okay. All right, Jill, great question. And so where we're going to look at your pre-flight checklist, and then we're going to look at your pre-takeoff checklist. And you're holding short of the line, and you haven't asked for clearance from the tower yet to take off, right? So those are 2 checklists that apply here. And remember PAVE, okay? So the first thing is looking at you, okay? And I will tell you that you are responsible for your own retirement and your retirement plan. If you have an advisor, you can't push this off because you're still the pilot flying the airplane. If you have a good advisor, maybe that advisor is a co-pilot, but they're doing co-pilot duties today. They're not doing piloting duties, okay? You're what's called the pilot flying. They're the pilot non-flying. So you still have to be responsible as the pilot to be knowledgeable about the different factors relative to retirement and make sure that you're okay. You can't trust the checklist to your co-pilot. And I hate to say that, but it's true. And what's on the checklist are, is your knowledge up to speed, okay? Then we just talked about a moment ago, the aircraft, right? The investments. Are the investments allocated properly, okay? Then the environment. Is the environment how's the environment right now? Is the environment, is it, are we in a recession? Are we going to recession? Is the market down? That's not a deal breaker, but it depends how close you are. If you've saved just barely enough to retire, then if the environment's wrong, it could be a risk factor. If you've got a little buffer with extra assets, then retiring in a recession may not be the worst thing, but it is a factor. And the last thing is the external influences, why you're retiring. In other words, is it because you got this great vision of what you want to do in retirement? You've heard me say many times, those who retire, who are moving toward a goal, live a much more rewarding retirement and fulfilled retirement in most cases than those who are moving away from a painful situation. So are you retiring for that reason? Is that the external influence, or is it because you don't like your boss anymore, or you hate what you do and you're just trying to get away from it? Or you're getting pressure from your spouse or significant other, okay? So that's a great way to use that aviation checklist to your advantage to determine whether or not you're ready to retire.
Jill, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers have a question that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. And thank you for joining us here on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today we're discussing ways that you can avoid an emergency in your retirement. So even though there were some recent issues with the Boeing plane, we've seen this happen in the past. There's emergencies. Flying by air is still the safest way to travel, and that's because of these checklists. And Dave, you ran through PAVE, P-A-V-E, which is personal pilot, aircraft, environment, external pressure when it comes to flying. So how do these checklists relate to people in the different stages of retirement, starting with, let's say, their pre-flight retirement checklist about 5 to 10 years out?
Right, so the pre-flight is, hey, I want to retire in 7 years, let's say, but is it realistic? When I look at what my pension will be, what Social Security will be, any rental income, as well as income from investments, and right now, if you have $1 million, it could generate 5%. It could generate $50,000 a year. But if rates go back down, maybe $1 million will only be able to generate $40,000 a year, or 4% in years coming. So you have to have a little buffer. Is it reasonable? And then we add that to what I'm saving over the years. Will I be there in 7 years? Will I have enough? Okay, so that's the airplane part of it, the A in the PAVE formula, right? And compare that to your I need goals, which you need to get by in retirement, versus your I want goals, which you really want to live the retirement of your dreams. The P is the tough part when you're pre-flighting in this case, because am I really going to want to retire 7 years from now? Or might I want to quit at 5? Or may I want to go to 10? I don't know. Okay, but you have to do your best assessment and continue to assess it every year between then and retirement. And that's the P, the pilot, right? I could be pre-flighting my airplane, and all of a sudden I feel great, but all of a sudden I start to feel nauseous, and last minute I decide to cancel it. Or I get a call on my cell phone that's a stressful call, which I've done. And I've decided to cancel my flight because that call got in my head and I'm no longer a safe pilot. So you could, at various stages of the pre-flight, you could say the P, the pilot, the person retiring, that plan has to change. Okay. Again, the aircraft has to do with your investments. And is it reasonable you can hit these goals without anything heroic being done? Okay. Then, the environment. And the environment, we don't know what the environment is going to look like 7 years down the road economically and financially, which is why if you're pre-flighting, you want to have a buffer. You want to make sure that in case the environment is bad, I've got enough of an income buffer in retirement that I will be okay. And then, of course, external influences. Why are you looking at retiring? Why do you think 7 years is the right number? Have you decided what you and your significant other want to do in retirement, right? We had a show recently, just last week, I think we talked about this actually, Sarah, where we talked about, how do you know if you're ready to retire externally, emotionally? And it has to do with being able to, practice retirement, right?
Right.
To be able to take long time off, pool your vacation days, and practice retirement. What's going to be like living in retirement. Interviewing people who have retired, who are happy, and those that retired that seem miserable. And see if you can figure out what makes the difference. So it's that hard work that has to go in, just like that hard work during a pre-flight, to make sure that those external influence that you're emotionally ready to retire in 7 years if 7 years is your goal.
Yeah. Well, what if you're not 5 to 10 years out? What if you're not 7 years out, Dave? What if you're in that hold short period and you're 6 to 12 months out? Well, we're going to tell you some of those tips and what you should be looking for on your checklist coming up. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton. And if you are looking for a checklist, if you're looking for a set of steps or different things that you can do before retirement, leading up to retirement, during retirement, and even in the later years of retirement, this show is for you, because we are covering all of those different aspects. And really, Dave, it's because of recent news. We saw what happened with the Boeing airplane, where they had the hatch or the plug door blow off, unfortunately, for the airplane, but luckily everyone was okay. And you mentioned that there were a lot of different things that just happened to go right in order for them to avoid an even larger disaster. And a lot of people are not taking the retirement as seriously. They say, oh, it's not the same thing as a plane crash, but it is extremely serious. It's a good chunk of your life. And there are different ways that you can be successful, leading up to, or we talked about leading up to retirement, your pre-flight checklist, right? 5 to 10 years out. What about someone that's in that 6 to 12 month range, before they want to retire?
They're ready to take off, sure.
Yep.
And by the way, the reason it is such a big deal is because, like I said, I can give you the textbook on how to fly a plane and land a plane and give it to you and then put you up in the plane, and the chance of you having a nice smooth landing are slim, and maybe even getting on the ground safely are slim. And that's because you can't learn how to fly an airplane through a textbook. Well, you can't learn how to retire through a textbook either. It can help get you prepped. It's good to learn that. But the problem with retirement is you haven't experienced it yet, which is why anybody who's trying to go it alone is taking a big risk. It's like me sticking you in that airplane as a flight instructor when I've never helped you physically land the plane anymore. Right. So, okay, assuming you have a financial advisor, assuming you have a co-pilot, right? So now the risks go down significantly, but you're still the pilot. You're still responsible for learning all this stuff, right? What does that pre-flight checklist look like? Well, what does that whole short checklist look like? Well, it's the same as the pre-flight, except now you're going through every item again. You're going through the pilot. You're going through the aircraft, which is the investments. But now you're 6 to 12 months before. You're doing a check before you give your notice. Is that okay? Are you still able to retire? Or are there environmental influences that maybe you're cutting it too close, maybe you need to postpone it for a few years? Or are there external influences that are maybe a bad reason to retire? So you decide, you know what? That's a risk. I'm not going to do that, right? So it's basically the checklist all over again when you're about to announce your retirement. And then you have the climb checklist. And the climb checklist is those first 6, 12 months, just 1 to 2 years in retirement. And that's where you've got to look at your money and say, okay, am I spending the amount of money that I think I'm spending? Or am I spending more? Is it all coming out of interest or dividends, or is some coming out of principal, right? Am I okay? If so, great. If not, you may have to make some decisions. You may say, well, I need to go to work part-time. Or maybe I can't do all these things I dreamt of in retirement. I need to cut back. Or maybe I need to change my allocation to generate even more interest and dividends because I didn't change it enough with my pre-takeoff checklist. Okay? And you got to watch those first 2 years as you're really getting into retirement and you're actually seeing how you physically land the airplane.
Well, let's get into our next Ask Dave question. We have a question here from Nick from Arizona. He says, my wife and I have been retired for a little over 5 years, but I feel like we're sort of on autopilot and we become complacent. What should we be doing right now?
All right, Nick, I love the question. And, I don't know whether you did your pre-flight checklist 5, 10 years before retirement, or you did your pre-takeoff checklist 6, 12 months before, or whether you even did your climb checklist in the early years, or whether you just have enough assets where it worked out. I don't know. But I will tell you that level flight, that cruise checklist, is more important than most pilots. A lot of pilots, not professional pilots, because they have to, but a lot of people like myself in an airplane, they get complacent because you're at level flight, the autopilot's on, everything looks good, and you forget to do your checklist at various phases in cruise flight. And you become complacent, just like you feel like you're becoming complacent right now. And I guess that makes sense to me because, again, you went through the first few years. You're only spending, hopefully, your interest and dividends. So, hey, what could go wrong, right? Well, the reality is, as you know, a lot can go wrong, even at cruise flight. So now the longer you're retired, it's not as dangerous, right? Like you said, you have a major market loss or major problem late in retirement. It's not as risky as if it happens in the first couple of years of retirement, but it still has risk. So what are some of the things you need to be looking at? Well, you need to constantly be reviewing your allocation to make sure you're getting enough income from interest and dividends, not taking anything out of principal or withdrawals. Then you have to make sure you're getting an inflation hedge. Is the noose tightening, financially speaking, with income, or are you having a good enough financial hedge? If you're not, or I should say inflation hedge. If you're not having a good enough inflation hedge, then you need to figure it out. Either you need to get more income that you're not spending, that you're reinvesting, or maybe you got to sacrifice a little income and go in stuff that's a little bit more growth oriented as a hedge for the future. But if you're feeling it 5-10 years into retirement, the stress of inflation, imagine how bad it's going to be 20-30 years into retirement. You also have to look at your budget and where are you spending now? Are you still spending on travel and all those things you do during the honeymoon stage of retirement? Or are you starting to focus more on settling in and maybe more the staples now? Maybe your expenses went down. Well, guess what? They could go back up when it comes to medical expenses, which bring me to the last component, which is how are you health-wise? Does your Medicare supplement plan actually help you? Is it the best for your situation, your spouse's situation? Maybe you need to spruce that up a notch. Maybe you need to look at your plans to cover you in case of convalescent care, full-time home health care, the risks that happen if you haven't done so already, okay? Those are things that should be on your cruise flight checklist once you get 5 years or more out of retirement or into retirement.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners out there have a retirement question or a question about different financial strategies that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email at askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. And we appreciate you spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton. And retirement is really a process, just like flying a plane. There's different parts of the flying process, right? Where you get the plane ready. Now you're ready for takeoff. Now you're ascending. Now you're in flight. Now you're descending. And Dave, there's a lot of ways that those checklists, in a sense, can apply to people that are also in different stages of retirement. So we covered what your pre-flight checklist should look like if you're 5 to 10 years out. We also talked about what your hold short checklist should look like, and that's about 6 to 12 months out. And you just answered a great question from Nick, who's someone that's really out of those early stages of retirement, but he is not at the end part of retirement yet. And I think this part is the most important part because, like you said, a lot of people, they get complacent, they're on autopilot, they think everything is going well. You
notice I have a bottle of water here. I'm drinking water. Did you notice that?
I did.
So I can only do that when we get toward the end of our cruise flight part, you see, because if I start drinking water during takeoff or early cruise flight, what most people don't realize is that commercial pilots are lucky. They get to use the lavatory, and if you're your own pilot, you don't get to use the lavatory. So since we're toward the end of the cruise flight, I get to drink some water right now. See, I don't have to interrupt our show for a bathroom break.
Oh, there you go. Well, see, and unfortunately, like your plane does not have a bathroom, which holding it for 5 to 6 hours is rough. But and we're not even going to talk about the options for pilots.
I don't know what it is that you're holding, but you're correct. Whatever you said, so I love the question just now because it's cruise flight, right? The pre-takeoff is really a repeat of your pre-flight checklist that you've done repeatedly throughout the years leading up to retirement. Your climb checklist is, looking at all your instruments early on, making sure that your spending habits are in where you thought they were and you're spending interest and dividends. But the cruise flight is the longest part of flight. And just time-wise, the most could go wrong because that is the longest part. And those are a majority of your retirement years, where you've got to think about and monitor where is my money being spent. Is less being spent on frivolous things and more being spent now on settling in or giving money to the grandchildren, or is more being spent on medical? And do I have to worry more about medical expenses, and how do I adjust my finances? And if this is the part of flight that we're hopefully, if you've successfully gone from being total return focused to being income first, growth second focused, then at least that makes this stage of flight easier because now the economy isn't as big. The V in the paved formula isn't as big of a deal because now all of a sudden, you're living off the I, you're living off the interest and dividends. So if your account drops in value, it shouldn't be as big of a deal. So that's the good news, but you still have to watch all these factors every couple of years in retirement because, again, it truly is the longest phase of flight, this phase that we call cruise flight, or really the level part of your retirement.
And that's not the last checklist that you need to be thinking about. Of course, there is the descent checklist, right? Your end of retirement checklist and the things you need to be thinking about to prepare for the end of your retirement. We're going to give you those tips next. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels. And today we kind of took a news item, and it's that Alaskan Air incident for that Boeing aircraft, where essentially what was, they call it the plug. Essentially, it's the emergency door spot that blew out of the aircraft, and how they got lucky that it happened at 16,000 feet instead of 36, and how we don't want to have you go through retirement based upon luck. So we took a chapter out of the FAA's formula, of course, with yours truly as a pilot, the PAVE formula, to say, okay, how do we create a checklist at all those various phases of flight? And so far, we've covered the pre-takeoff checklist, right? The things you need to pay attention to when you're 5, maybe 7, maybe even 10 years out of retirement. Then the pre-takeoff checklist, where you're about ready to go into retirement, you check all those gauges again. Then the climb checklist, where you're trying to figure out, is my spending really in line with what I thought it would be in my early years of retirement, or is it not? And then lastly, we covered the cruise checklist, the longest part of retirement, where you're in level flight, you settle in a routine in retirement, you settle in a spending pattern. But it may seem like the safest phase of flight, but it could be the most dangerous because it's also the longest part of your retirement, which means more things can go wrong.
Yep. And of course, it's not the end of your retirement, because you're climbing, right? The descent of your retirement. So there's a checklist, of course, for the things that you need to be on the lookout for and make sure that you're doing as you're nearing the end of your retirement, which could be 30 years or more in these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny because you know nobody knows when the end of the retirement is, right?
Right.
And
it's a nicer way of saying,
yeah, that's
the end
right.
of your
That's right.
life.
Well, normally we have a descent checklist and a pre-landing checklist.
Yeah.
But again, unless you're terminally ill, you can't do a pre-landing checklist. So we combine them into a descent checklist. But it's important to look at this because it as you get up in age, and it's kind of when, I think about the descent part of your retirement as when you're getting up in age and when you're feeling like, I'm just not as sharp as I used to be. I can't do the things I used to be. And, maybe if I want a free vacation, I may not even want to take it because it's too much hassle. That's when you've got to start thinking about the descent. And it might be a little morbid to think about it. And most people think about, estate planning and everything else. But the reality is, it's not about estate planning. It's not just about death. It's about, who's going to take over my finances if all of a sudden I'm incapable, I'm drooling over myself, right? So that who can take you in those later years of retirement? Who's going to make medical decisions for you? Because, if you can't make medical decisions for yourself, you have to name somebody to do that. So there's lots of things in this realm that we call estate planning that are part of that descent part of your life that go into that descent checklist.
And of course, these are things that you want to do before you're in the descending part of it. That way you make sure that you're making the best decisions. But what exactly should you be doing? What sort of power should you be assigning to people? Well, our next Ask Dave question has to do with that. So we have Debbie from New Jersey, and she says, what are the different documents that I need? What makes up an estate plan when it comes to medical care and other health care needs? Well,
Debbie, it's a great question, and I'm glad you understand the need for an estate plan, because the first problem that I see people make is they say, well, I don't need an estate plan. I don't have an estate. Estates are for rich people, And Debbie, maybe you are rich. I don't know. But, estate planning is for everyone. If you own a car, you have an estate. If you have a savings account, you have an estate. 401k, you have an estate, right? So it's important to do the appropriate planning. So what are the documents? Well, the first thing starts with a will, right? A will helps instruct the courts, whom you want as beneficiary of your assets. It names somebody as an executor that can help settle the estate with the will. So the first thing is having a will. A lot of people take it a step further and they do a living trust. Why? Because with a living trust, you can avoid probate. Most people think, gee, a will can avoid probate. Well, no. What a will does is put your assets through probate. In fact, the word probate comes from the Latin term probare, which means to prove the validity of the will that's being shown to the court that this truly is your last will and testament and your wishes. So a will put you into probate. But a trust can help you avoid probate and can help you put stipulations in there to essentially, to some degree, run the money from the grave. So a lot of people take that next step into a living trust. But then you want to have a durable power of attorney, right? What if I can't make financial decisions, whether I'm in a coma or I'm just starting to get dementia? And now somebody else needs to be able to step in my role. Because remember, you are the pilot. Your advisor is only the co-pilot. Your advisor can't do this without you, right? You're the pilot. And if the pilot fails, you need a backup primary pilot who could jump in there. And the durable power of attorney designates who that is. Then you want to have a healthcare agent. Who's the person who's going to make healthcare decisions for you? Pull the plug, don't pull the plug, life support, and all that, right? So you want to get that designation of healthcare agent. And last, you want to get a living will, which gives instructions to that healthcare agent, you know, when you might want some life extension versus under what circumstances you may not. So again, those are really the 5 major documents that you'll be looking at as part of that estate plan.
Debbie, thank you so much for sending in your question about estate planning. And if you have a question, maybe about your estate plan or your retirement strategy, you can always reach out to us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. And thank you for spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today we've covered all the different things that you need to do at different stages of retirement. So we've talked about before retirement, that 5 to 10 year period. We talked about the 6 to 12 month period before you retire. We've talked about the first year or so after you retire, that climb period, right, when you're in early retirement. And Dave, you also mentioned some different things people can do to avoid becoming complacent in the later part of those years. In addition to that, we've covered the descent, the end of retirement, which is estate planning. But another huge part of this, Dave, and estate planning goes hand in hand with this, but another big part is the legacy. What sort of legacy you may want to leave behind, and planning for that as well.
And you notice that now that we're in the descent, I can finish my bottle of water now.
Yeah, you finished the water.
We'll
now,
be
no
on the
more
ground
water.
near a lavatory in a few minutes, so it's perfect here. Descent part of our checklist, descent part of today's show. You know, it just comes to planning. Now, I'm not saying you wait till you're at advanced age to do that type of planning, but it's even more important at advanced age. And you might retire and redo your estate plan, but you might find that, you know, your executor gets dementia before you, or somebody passes away before you, and you've got to make adjustments. And again, don't count on your co-pilot for this. It's your responsibility to be the pilot flying the airplane. Your advisor is the pilot not flying. Now, the pilot not flying, some are more proactive than others, but I'm here to tell you that I want you to be in charge of your own destiny, which means checking your estate plan more frequently in those later years of retirement than perhaps you ever have, because that's when things can change, and you want to tweak that plan along the way.
Yep. And of course, too, you want to make sure that you want to have a plan that is flexible. And that's why the Investing for Income strategy is a great plan before retirement and through retirement, really through all of these stages of retirement, because it helps eliminate part of that risk that you mentioned, Dave, that risk you might have from the V, which stands for environment, even though environment starts with an E, but okay, you know, whatever. So that part kind of, it helps us understand why you need income and why it's so helpful.
Well, and what you have is, you know, we talk about your checklist, your holding short checklist, and you're ready to take off, right? What we didn't talk about is, in a lot of aircraft, you're doing a run-up at that point. You're running up the engine, you're checking the gauges, you're making sure everything's okay before you take off. And that's one of the reasons it's important to make that transition from being total return focused, irrespective of whether your return's coming from the I or the G, the income or the growth, before retirement. Because you got to do your run-up before. That's the time to check and see, okay, are all my engine parameters good? My electrical looks good. That's also where you need to look at if you have de-icing equipment. Is my de-icing equipment working? Right? So it's that run-up period before you take off. But in this world, you don't want to wait till you get to the hold short line to do your run-up in retirement, because you want to stress it beforehand. And by the way, if you try to make that transition from being growth-oriented or total return-oriented regardless of where it's coming from, to an income focus, and you try to do it when you're holding short, that's great. But what happens if the market happens to be down, and all of a sudden now you have 25% less money than you thought you had a year before, and now you're trying to make a transition from the G to the I, and now you get to that hold short and you realize, oop, I got to taxi back to the apron. I can't I can't take off today, right?
Well, that's
so
why-
that's why
yeah.
you've got to start that pre-flight checklist 5 to 10 years before retirement.
Yeah. And doing it with a retirement income specialist can also help lower your own risk because, like Dave said, you're responsible, but having someone that understands the right way to get you income and really understands what phase of life you're in retirement is going to be extremely helpful. We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you want to listen to this show, maybe send it to your friends or family that are looking at different checklists for their stage of retirement. All you have to do is go to retirementincomesourceradioshow.com.
And we'd love it if you do that. And most importantly, we hope that you're here with us next week for next week's flight. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.